Many of you already know of him, if some of you have met him, and a few colleagues here as well. We'll get into some of his background, I think, as we're doing the questioning, but there are a number of reasons why we're excited to have this opportunity to have this chat with Joel Klein. So you can go ahead and sit down. But among those is there just aren't that many folks who have been in these prominent high decision-making positions at different levels. So broadly speaking, chancellor of New York City Department of Education, also experience working in the White House, but more U.S. Justice side there. Private sector experience. Just it's very rare to have someone who has such a broad perspective, but also with a lot of depth with the positions there. So I thought, especially for this type of conversation, we're talking about these really big ideas of inequality and mobility that touch on so many sectors of society. Makes Joel a perfect person to talk to on this topic to get his sort of thoughts around it. So I'm going to begin with just sort of the broad question, and then we'll try to narrow down some, and then just let me know so that the passage of time, because I want to make sure to open it up for Q&A for others. So the first sort of broader question is speaks to the theme for today, and that is this idea of these two interrelated concepts of inequality, but also mobility or opportunity. And just to sort of context some of the speakers have sort of talked about it. I think Miles was saying, well, it's really not an either or. It's sort of these are two concepts. Although in our political discourse, sometimes we treat them as sort of being in tension. And I think it was earlier someone, I think it was Mike Howe, sort of had this term, sort of the inequality of opportunity is sort of something we need to think about as well. But for you, how do you see these two ideas?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for your kind introduction, proving once again that I'm a man who is incapable of holding a job. Energy. Second, it's really a privilege to be here today, and I'm so glad that you folks from the business school are focusing on these issues, because to me, these are going to be the defining issues for what kind of country and what kind of people we are going to be. The course we're on now, I don't think is long-term sustainable. And so let me start by saying the most important issue, I don't see it as either or, but I do see it as a prioritization. And that is, if we don't get mobility and opportunity right, then we are really going to be in a hole. If all we do is try to redistribute, which is something that's legitimate, but if that's all we do, it's going to be incomplete in a dramatic way. What I mean by that is, you think about what holds a society together. It's a sort of deep belief in America, not based on religion, not based on uniformity of background. It's based on a simple notion that we used to call the American dream. And when I was running the schools in New York, I used to talk a lot about the challenge for this generation is whether the American dream becomes the American memory on our watch. What I mean by that is, if kids who are born in poor families, who grow up in difficult circumstances, don't have an exit out, then we're going to end up in a very stratified, very disconnected society. If you read Charles Murray's Coming Apart book, you see some of the implications of all of that. And so the first priority has got to be opportunity. So you see kids going to colleges now, kids from the bottom quintile are very hardly going to top colleges, disproportionately not going. Kids who grow up in poverty, especially of course children of color who are disproportionately kids who grow up in poverty, those kids are not getting an education into K-12 remotely what they need to succeed. So if you start, and for the first time in my lifetime, most Americans believe their kids' lives will be worse than theirs. that would have made my parents, my father was a postman, my mother was a bookkeeper, they would have made their lives intolerable, because the thing that made their lives tolerable is the thought that their children would have a better life. And people live with the notion that the kids are stuck in a rut, and that poverty is an intergenerational process, and that's going to take away hope. On top of that, you see the wealthy getting obscenely wealthier and wealthier. And so it no longer is this notion that if you succeed in America, it's because you've done great things and merit matters. It's this notion that I'm stuck, these other people are getting more and more, and the game is rigged. And once you believe that, the glue that holds the society together begins to erode. So the issue you're talking about is mission critical. The problem is clear. I mean, if I took the kids, I was sitting next to somebody at lunch, if I took our kids an assignment to one of my schools in a high poverty neighborhood in New York, she would become a radical. Because the education you get there is not accepted, and her kids are privileged kids. So if you don't fix these kinds of things, you get this negative cycle that's almost impossible to reverse. And so defining the problem is not that hard. Fixing the problem is enormously hard. And if it's not people of commitment with real leadership skills, deep vision, and a willingness to fight a very resistant status quo, then these problems are not going to go away. It's not a wishing and hoping game, and resources alone, while important, are not going to solve it. It's going to be much more complex.
Thank you. Thank you. So let me build on one of your last points, that finding the problem is not as challenging as actually fixing the problem. And I was wondering if you could reflect, and maybe if you had an example of an educational reform that worked, and your thought about why it worked, and maybe even an idea or a reform that seemed like a good idea but didn't work, and maybe why you think that it didn't work.
Well, we can spend much more time on the first part of that question. Okay. Sure. I think the reform that worked best in New York City and throughout the nation even built on a concept that I started with, right? My headline, my tagline, my brand was children first, a system of great schools, not a great school system. And through that, we were communicating something very powerful. Bureaucrats, unions, politicians, they look at the system. Parents and kids look at the school. People say, does New York City have a good school system? I'd say, depends what school you go to. We had some of the best schools in the nation. We had some schools, quite frankly, that sucked. That if your kids went there, as I said before, you'd be a revolutionary. So to me, the unit that mattered, that you had to get right, was the school. And the thing that changed the city is our willingness to shut down dysfunctional schools and replace them with neutral schools, both charter and district. When it comes to my kids, I got no politics on this charter district business. I want a good school. And I believe most parents are the same way. And so we opened up under Bloomberg 500 schools in the city. About a third of them were charters, and James Merriman, who's here, was a vital partner with us running the charter center here in New York and doing a lot of the politics and a lot of the organizational work. But those schools changed the lives of kids. And none of them were a mandatory school. Everybody had at least one other choice, the school where you live. And so those schools had to earn their kids, which was really weird, because everybody else thought of schools as having a catchment area where you get the kids who live between 108th and 114th Street and 6th Avenue and 8th Avenue. So all these new schools, these 600, which is about a third of the number in the city, all of those schools had to earn their kids. And by any measure, any study, MDRC studied this, they studied it at Stanford on a chart, by any measure, those schools are performing higher. When I started, there were about 10,000 kids, not even, about 6,000 kids in charter schools in New York. Today there's over 125,000 kids, overwhelmingly children of color, largely kids growing up in poverty, whose families chose those schools. So that clearly worked, and the results were demonstrably successful. Actually, I could go through a long litany of things that don't work, but it doesn't bother me, because if you want to do big and bold things, you gotta be prepared to understand that nobody bats 1,000. The one I liked, and I wouldn't say it was a failure, but it certainly didn't work the way I hoped it would, was putting a letter grade on schools. So my theory was, if you could give people choices, you ought to give them some information, and we thought we could basically make that a compact A to F system. Internally, it worked for us because it enabled us to know which schools to shut, where we needed to replace principals, etc. Externally, it became too reductionistic, too simplistic, and quite frankly, and this is on me, too test-driven. So that was one that didn't, but you can go through others that didn't. In the end, the reason I had this very discussion with a reporter for the New York Times, who I respected, and I will tell you, the fun part of the job is not having reporters to deal with. This person said to me, we had opened up like 100 new small high schools, and he said to me, he was doing a series of, out of the 100, the 10 or so that failed. And I said, for goodness sake, that means 90 succeeded, and every week you write another school that failed. Why don't you write a few other schools that succeeded? And he said, well, in the newspaper business, we don't write about the planes that land, we write about the planes that crash. And I said, in the education business, the news is the planes that land. So much has crashed. And that's why, in terms of what we did on the new schools and how that shifted the overall performance in the district, that's a major story, and I think one of the best instantiations of meaningful school reform in the country.
Thank you. I have in my mind some follow-up questions, so I'm going to hold this. I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up, and then maybe we can come up. So I'm going to get your thoughts about another thing which has come up so far in our discussion. So data-wise, especially for some of this research, it focuses on having college education or finishing college, and even in the morning there was a discussion about community college. And some of the speakers also sort of spoke to the fact that there are activities and things we need to think about before one goes to college, and this gets into sort of secondary education, and even pre-K. I was wondering, from your perspective, what do you think that folks may, is there anything that folks may underappreciate or can get more, become more knowledgeable about the connection between secondary and post-secondary education in terms of policies or things that implement, whether there's things that sometimes we're making policy at one level, let's say K through 12, but that has implications for higher education, or the other way around. Part of what I'm trying to think through is a lot of the discussion these days is college for all. There's a discussion around community colleges and the role of community colleges, and I always wonder, how should we understand that with respect with what's going on in K through 12?
To me, first of all, 2 points. This notion, like take community college as a perfect example. So kids go to community college, graduation rates are abysmal, right? So for people in preschool, the notion of a return on investment is pretty second nature. And the return on investment we're getting on community colleges is appalling. So why doesn't somebody figure out how we can fix those things before we continue to try to drive more kids there who are going to graduate at 12 or 14%? And that's a classic example of where we don't focus on the right part of the picture. And to me, the right part of the picture is, can a kid graduate with the skills necessary to be competitive and successful in an ever-increasing global, high-tech, skills-driven economy? That's the question, and we got to fulfill that mission. Telling me a kid went to college, comes out after a year and a half with a few courses under his belt or her belt, and not prepared for anything is meaningless. Second of all, the interconnection. So I try to do things because it seemed to me a high school education alone was not enough. But trying to bridge through and put the post-secondary in a different world from the secondary means you have a built-in discontinuity. There are a few states where the education czar, the education chief, has got K-12 and post-secondary, which is what we should do, because it's not about what box you're in, it's about what education, what preparation you get. And the third thing you mentioned, which I think is vitally important, and we didn't do, but I think is critical, we're wasting the earliest years in these kids' lives. From 0 to 5, we've got to do a lot more education, because losing those years means that kids who come from challenging environments start out a year and a half, 2, 3 years behind. And if you've got a lot of problems in life and a family that's struggling, and you're 2 to 3 years behind, it's just Sisyphean to think that you're going to turn that around. And the last answer to your question is, of course you've got to connect K-12 and the post-secondary world. But I am telling you, when people, if I run Harvard University, what I think about is Harvard University. And I don't worry about what's happening in K-12. And so if you don't make those connections, you get no accountability, no ownership, and as a result, very little change.
So before asking more questions, I'm going to open it up now for others. Okay, and just let me know about it.
Hi. So this morning we talked a lot. I'm just gonna shout.
Go for it.
So this morning we had a lot of really good conversations about higher education, equity, equality, and access. I see a lot of parallels to the discussion that's happening in the city right now about specialized high schools. Can you share your thoughts about that system and how there are inequitable access between diverse groups? You know, it's not necessarily income, but that's a major conversation in the system right now. So,
But it goes to a lot. It seems to me again the focus on a specialized high school. I can make the argument for or against, and I know I've heard it both ways. But it goes to a much more profound inequity, which is, why are we not preparing kids from all communities to be able to take advantage of the opportunities? And it starts at day one. So let me give you 2 schools, which I'll make up. One is basically on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and another one is in basically South Bronx. As the crow flies, they're 7 miles apart, let's say 5 miles apart. In one school, the kids come, their families are all middle class, the kids come well prepared, starting in kindergarten or even in pre-K. In the other school, kids come with enormous challenges. Now the school with the kids with the challenges, I used to have to turn over every year 10, 15, 20 teachers out of 30, 40 teachers. Now what the hell kind of operation is that? Anybody who runs an organization and is turning over more than half its people each year should go out of business. Whereas the school on the Upper East, when I had a vacancy, very few vacancies, but somebody would retire or maybe move out of New York, I would get 400 or 500 applicants for the one position. So what I knew what I was doing from day one was basically setting up a system which the kids with the greatest challenges are going to get the crummiest education. Not because anybody's a bad person, because the system was designed that way. Worse, the way you had to pay people was, if you're a 20-year person, you get paid at $80,000, $90,000 a year. If you're a first-year person, you get paid half that. So the way they accounted for that was they didn't differentiate the amount of money. They only differentiated the number of teachers. So all my resources are going to my stable communities and my middle class and affluent communities. And the kids who are getting basically the biggest challenges are getting teachers who are turning over, rookie teachers, et cetera, et cetera. So I try to drive resources, create incentives to get some of my best people to go that 5 miles with a crow, from the middle of Manhattan to the South Bronx, and deal with the challenging kids. And of course I couldn't do that because the union contract forbade me from doing it. So if you build in inequality in the system, then when those kids get time to go to high school, Very few of them get into Stuyvesant, very few of them get into the Bronx side. And so then that becomes an A1 news story. And I promise you, whatever we do with Stuyvesant or whatever we do with those specialized schools, if we don't solve the Southern problem, it won't matter. But things that are in the news, particularly now in the world of social media and soundbite and Twitter and all this garbage, that kind of world lends itself to sensationalism, and now we're going to deal with this issue. And solving it, whichever way you want to solve it, is worth fighting about, but it isn't going to solve the problem I just described between the South Bronx and what's going on in the middle of Manhattan. And if we don't solve that problem, then we're going to have a deep series of divisions in this country. And you think about it, while that's going on, all the country is fighting about this. Nothing going on in Washington that relates to the needs of the people. All they're fighting about is positioning for the next election, keeping their jobs, and the kids who need help and the families who need help, to help with them.
Thanks. Mike, I got to speak earlier, so I'll keep it short, but I just want to push back on the notion that the community colleges are hopeless. In the late 70s, the transition rate from entering a community college and ending up with a BA was only 7%. It's now in the mid-20s, roughly a 4 times improvement. And this with an under-endowment and an under-investment. And I think that the community colleges are getting undersold here a little bit.
It's a fair pushback, but in 50 years, to get to 20%, right? I mean, it's better than 7. But the question is it the best use of our money? And it goes to the question you asked him, which is, do we think about this not as whether they're a community college, but whether we have an effective, integrated educational system? So the thing I did, which I think changed the entire outcomes, I got together with a guy from IBM who was the president, and I said, let's create a 6-year school. They don't have these things. It's 4 years high school, 2 years community college. I went to Matt Goldstein, who was then the chancellor of the City University, and I said, let's do something nobody does. We'll take one of yours and one of mine, we'll put them together. We'll get IBM involved in this, and we'll create a school called P-Tech. P-Tech, those kids either almost all matriculate to college, or they go to work for IBM after 2 years of community college. So that's systems thinking that doesn't just say, well, I ended up high school, now I'm going to find a 2-year school, maybe I'll matriculate. And I just think we've got to get out of what I call box thinking into people thinking. And the community college as an isolated phenomenon, I think has, in the end, little ROI. Now, if you could integrate it, like these kids who are coming through 4 years of an IBM-supported program, I think you can get very different results. So it's not a knock, per se, on community colleges, but much more a sense of, why don't we think about the child rather than think about the institution?
So back to the question about inequity in the New York City school system. You mentioned the hypothetical school on the Upper East Side and in the South Bronx. I'm on the Upper West Side in District 3, which includes Columbia. And looking at the elementary schools, about half of them are extraordinarily good schools, and the other half are basically failing schools. And it's all completely economic-based, racial-based, geographic-based. If you were in charge right now and you had to do something to address this problem, what fixes do you think are available? What could be done?
The only thing I know is to continue to build more good schools and shut down the ones that don't work. And that's what we've done up there. And to the extent you can, you solve the problem. The one thing you're not going to do, I mean, we'll see what happens, but if you think you're going to try to gerrymander the schools and create sort of the old notion that we'll sort of use the integration of the schools as a way to solve the education problem, you can do some of that in Godspeed, but in the end, there's a reason that didn't work, and that's because people on the Upper West Side were probably as progressive a group of people as possible. When it comes to their kids' education, they want excellence. And they would tell me, if their schools decline, if they don't get the quality of education they need, don't move to Westchester or wherever. So I think what we've got to do is continue to build more good schools, give parents more options, and use that as a mechanism to succeed. You can do some kind of, if you will, balancing, but again, in a city that's 70% African American and Latino, balancing is not going to be the solution to the long-term problem. That's my view.
Joe, can innovative models like P-TECH scale into comprehensive?
Can innovative models like P-TECH scale? Yes. Right now, in the state of New York alone, there's probably 20 P-TECHs. Globally, there's well over 100. And any scaling effort takes hard work, but yes, they can scale. And look, we opened up probably 150 small high schools. And I would say 90% of them were modestly to significantly good. So there's, and the MDRC has studied this carefully. So there's a scaling reform that worked. We opened up, how many, Jim? 150, James, 150 charter schools?
Something like that.
3/4 of those charter schools are at least a standard deviation better. So this is scalable. It's got to be done properly, and like anybody who does organizational change, there'll be screw-ups and bumps on the way. But I think, for example, on P-TECH, the thing that was so important to me is not everybody's going to want to go for a 4-year college education. And so not creating a meaningful vocational track, which you bring in people like IBM or Goldman Sachs to work with the system to help create pathways for kids. If you do that properly, I think you can get really great results. And so, yeah, I think scaling is never easy, whether it's in business or the public sector. It's harder in the public sector because the resistances are greater, but I think it's doable.
Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, there we go. Thank you so much. We've talked a lot throughout the day, and you mentioned it earlier about really the early childhood years being so critical to setting children up to succeed in school from kindergarten on. Pay parity is a huge issue in New York City right now between the center-based pre-K and 3K programs and the school-based programs. Is there anything that you can speak to about equalizing those kinds of things to make sure that we're accommodating and putting the best foot forward in communities that need it the most?
Yeah, totally. And it goes to the same point I was trying to make at the other end. Again, it's not a knock on community college. It's that we think in political box-checking terms. So K-12 is a system we have, and so there's a lot of people there. Those people vote, and they spend money on elections, and they have power. So they want to drive the money into the system. That's why I said it's about great schools. I don't give a shit about the system. I care about the school because I care about it for my daughter, and I'll care about it for everybody else's kid. And so when you think about the problem, you got this 0 to 5 thing, and it's no money there. And I give the current mayor credit for at least creating a pre-K and for a 4-year-old. There's no money there. But if you were to think about the needs of kids, and somebody were responsible for reallocating resources, you would need to move the money down, particularly for kids who are growing up in dysfunctional communities. And the answer to your question is, this is so classic. I mean, the fights every year between whether you fund the charter schools higher and this one and this one and this one. Give the funding, let the funding follow the child. You want to send your kid to a center that's not run by the school district? It's the kid's money. It's her education. So everything I try to do is say the money goes where the kid goes. Kid, your family want to go to charter school, $15,000 go to that charter school. Your family want to go to district school, $15,000 go to that district school. It's the kid, but politics and power and structure basically doesn't allow you to do something that rational. And so it's hard to move dollars that are sticky because of political power. It's very hard to move them where they need to go. would say is what I said, is let the money follow the child. Why should I, if you want to send your kid to a charter or to a district, God bless you. Why should I care whether it's $25,000 here or there?
There were a couple hands in the back.
Thank you so much for coming. And I just had a quick question about scalability. How do you see scaling this system, like P-TECH as an example, into the Rust Belt or into other places around the country that aren't centers of business and maybe there aren't Goldman Sachs and the IBMs to deploy that kind of capital to build out those programs? What challenges do you see with scaling across the country?
There are challenges, no question, but again, in the Rust Belt, there are industries there, they may be not IBM, but there are industries there, and in some respects, in the smaller community, it may be easier to engage the various industries in this school system. All I know is when I started this thing with P-TECH, it started on a basic one-person conversation, and it keeps migrating, not just throughout the US now, including in places in the Midwest and South, but also throughout the globe. I mean, I was recently in Australia, they're opening up P-TECHs in Australia. So, and this goes to why I spent, people ask me, well, why did I come here to talk? Of course, the honorarium is not that great, so I didn't know. So why do I come here? I've got more chicken than any human being. When you're school chancellor, you have like 5 chicken dinners. I come here for one reason, because the people in this room want to change the world. So, how do things scale? People make things scale. People are creative. I mean, the way P-TECH started literally, I was sitting next to this guy who was a rain delay at the US Open. He's the CEO of IBM. And he said, let's have a glass of wine while we wait for the rain to stop. And he says to me, is IBM doing enough for the schools? I said, no. So people say, well, that's a pretty pissy thing to say at a tennis match to the CEO. He said, what would you like to do? And I had this fantasy. And so the way things scale is people of talent and vision who are willing to take the risk of doing something different and the risk of failing. Because if you do the same thing, you can basically not change anything, but the risk of failure is small. So scaling anything, I mean, when Google started, when Jeff Bezos did it at Amazon, everybody knew how to scale. But getting it done took leadership, it took organization, it took management, it took foresight. And so why I come here is because probably as much talent in any room, as much talent in this room as any room right now in New York City. And if the people in this room, starting with you, figured out how to scale this in the Rust Belt, it didn't happen.
I think this is last question. This is the last question.
So thank you. I so appreciate your candor about the system. And as an early childhood educator in the city, in the CBO, the teacher shortage is all over the place in the city and it's only going to get worse. And I'm wondering what you think the Department of Ed should be doing in terms of creating new teachers and recreating a pipeline that is only going to continue that East Side, Harlem, South Bronx problem.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a couple of different, one is resource allocation, which I talked about in response to your question. The other thing is a really major rethink about the ed schools in America and how they connect up to the K-12 system. And again, this is one of these things. When I'm running the ed school at a university, I'm not connected into, you know, so when ed schools and universities, including when Columbia asked me about this, you know, they used to say to me, well, when I was chancellor, what can I do to help you? And I'd say, here's what you can do. I'd say, why don't you run one of my schools for me? Open up a school and make it work. If you show me you can educate my kids, it's the most important thing in the world. And if you can't, what the hell are you to people who are educating my teachers to teach my kids if you can't educate my kids? And so a few of them took the challenge. A lot of them, in fact, made me rebuff me. So it's again what I call the discontinuity of organizations trying to solve a human problem where all the focus is on the organization. And so if I'm running an ed school for a university, what I'm worried about is getting enough kids there, enough funding, enough faculty to keep my game going. The one thing I'm not spending a lot of time, which I spend a ton of time on, is am I producing the people that the K-12 system in America needs to deal with these kids who we're talking about, that are basically the kids in the South Bronx or the kids in Central Brooklyn that are not getting in. So that, to me, is the only way this is going to be fixed. And that's going to take a lot of leadership at the university level. I once sat with Larry Summers and Newt Gingrich, and I'll end on this note, because I thought it was one of the most brilliant insights I'd ever heard from anyone, which was Newt Gingrich had done the Contract on America. I was then trying to reform the New York City public schools, and Larry Summers had just been fired at Harvard as president. And he said, you know, Joel and Newt are having a good time, of course, because they're still employed. He said, but I'll tell you, here's the problem. Newt had the easiest challenge. This was his creation challenge. He could start something with the Contract of America, et cetera, et cetera. Joel had the second easiest challenge because he was trying to make big changes in something that most people thought was broken. He said, I had an impossible challenge. He said, because I was trying to make big changes in something people thought was great. He said, try and get the political wind behind me for that. And that's exactly the problem. The ed schools are focused on their problem, and then I don't mean mine personally, and they're not focused on my kids' problems. So if you don't fix that, I don't know how you fix it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that dialogue, and like I said, thank you for the candor, your thoughts to really push us to think this through. And I really like this overall atmosphere from the proposals from the speakers to the ideas you're tossing out. I'm really happy that we're thinking big about this, and I also, as you might imagine, agree that this is quite a special room. This is the room to have these kinds of conversations, to really think about these big ideas, to exchange with one another, and to continue making connections.
Okay, so look, if you don't think big, nothing big will happen. And if you're not prepared to risk failure, nothing big will happen. The easiest thing in the world is to do nothing and just stay in place. The hardest thing in the world is to risk. But the world we live in now, absent risk, we're not going to do big things. And absent big things, over time, we're going to pay an enormous, enormous price for it.
Those are words to end on. So I'm going to end this period, so another thank you very much.